Okay, it's the appointed hour, so out of respect for everyone's time, we're going to move forward. As we gather here today, I think it's appropriate that we remember the folks impacted by the tornadoes over the weekend. Lots of devastation there, lots of suffering. Dr. Woodward, as we speak, is on the ground there, representing us well in a stellar fashion, as she always does. So as we begin this history presentation, the medical center's connectedness with our state continues. My name is Ralph Didlake. I'm director of the Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities, and it's my pleasure to present the UMMC 101 presentation for this month. It would be absolutely impossible for me to give a comprehensive history of the medical center. Plus, I'm just not qualified to do that. I claim no expertise as a historian, but I have been around a while and observed a fair amount of the history of this institution. And what I'm going to share with you are just some observations about our history. You certainly recognize this picture. This is us today. How did we get here? There are lots of ways to answer that question. We can certainly answer it through looking at our missions. As I'm going to describe, really education is the core reason that the medical center was founded, but we also have an important research and clinical care mission that have their own rich and distinct histories. We also have a history in the way that we are connected with the remainder of the state. What is our role as a state agency, as a state resource, as a component of the larger functioning of our state? We also have an administrative history. We can look at it through that lens and look at who have been our leaders and what has been our administrative structure. We can look at our history through a purely physical lens. How have we grown? But as any state agency, there are political features, huge political features. We could spend days just looking at the political history of the University of Mississippi Medical Center. And then again, what is our position socially, culturally? What has been our participation in the social and cultural evolution of our state? Now, even though we started as an education enterprise, this campus was not the origin. The University of Mississippi Medical Center traces its roots back to a 2-year medical school on the Oxford campus that was established in 1903 as a department of medicine of the University of Mississippi. Now, it was not the first medical school in the state. Centenary College, that today resides in Shreveport, Louisiana, was originally established in Brandon Springs, Mississippi in 1842. There was a large spa at a springs there that went out of business, and the owner donated the buildings to a group that was trying to found a new college, associated with the Methodist of Mississippi. And they established the college there, including a law school. Law school is kind of generous. They offered a law degree. Medical school is equally generous. They offered an A.B. in medicine. But it was the first institution, the first chartered institution in the state of Mississippi to produce medical graduates, degree-holding medical graduates, who entered practice in the state under the licensure of that time. Now, it was short-lived. It only lasted for 3 years because it was, after all, in the middle of nowhere, way outside Brandon, which was about that big at the time. Its assets were collapsed with the Louisiana University to form the present-day Centenary College. There were other proprietary schools prior to this medical school. Among them was the Mississippi Medical College in Meridian. But returning to our Oxford campus, this school struggled almost from its very beginning. And I have blocked out part of this picture. This picture was taken in the very early part of the 20th century when people were less sensitive about displaying human remains than we are today. But to show that it was a meager enterprise. Then along comes the Flexner Report, which was the nationwide survey of medical schools in the country in 1910. It had harsh criticism for that school, but it continued to survive, offering 2 years of essentially what we would call today basic science training. The people who completed that program would go out of state to receive their clinical training and then come back into the state for licensure. That rocked along until really just after the Second World War. And in a very real way, we can trace our existence on this campus to the state of Mississippi, the state in which Mississippi was immediately after the First World War. There was a significant population decline. There were only 61 physicians per 100,000 people. Many of the physicians who left the state to join the military during the conflict did not return to the state. And those that did, those that remained and those that did return, were absolutely distributed across the state, largely in the larger urban areas. Now, state leaders, including the Mississippi legislature and the governor, were examining two schools of thought about how to resolve this lack of physicians for our state. One camp felt that if the state entered a statewide hospital building program, that you would build hospitals in communities and the physicians would just come. The second camp, the competing camp, said, no, we should build a 4-year school of medicine and train our own young men and women to be the physicians for our state. Now, the first idea, this hospital building program idea, made some really good sense because of the Hill-Burton Act that was signed by Harry Truman in 1946. If a community could demonstrate a need and the ability to sustain an operating hospital, there was federal grant money available to help the town build that hospital. So that made perfect sense. And that happened a lot across our state. There are a number of examples. Here's one from Hazelhurst, the old Hardy Wilson Hospital that existed there from 1950. There are many healthcare institutions in our state today that can track their lineage back to these Hill-Burton funds. And if there are any DHA candidates or students in the audience, there's your capstone project right there to trace the impact of Hill-Burton Act on Mississippi. The competing camp felt equally strongly that the 4-year School of Medicine was the way to go. Don't need to build these hospitals in the communities, we just need to train our own. So the 1950 Mississippi legislature had House Bill 628, which was simply described appropriation, construction of a 4-year medical school in Jackson. Now, that sounds like a great idea, but the opposing camp was very strong, and there was not unanimous agreement within the legislature about this appropriation. In fact, Representative Zelma Price of Greenville, who had been injured in an auto accident and was hospitalized at Baptist, was transported by ambulance to the Capitol, to the House Appropriations Committee, to cast the 16th and deciding vote for the appropriation of the University of Mississippi Medical Center. That's how close it was. We are here by a thin margin of 1 vote. But it made it through the legislature, and Governor Hugh White signed the bill into law in April of 1950. Now that, however, was not the end of the funding story. The forces in the legislature were strong enough, they blocked actual funding of that appropriation for another couple of years. And the legislation also required Hinds County to pass a bond issue before construction could start. It was not just legislative money, it was bond money from Hinds County. And that also was not a slam dunk. So if we go back to the newspapers of the day, the Clarion Ledger strongly supported passing this bond referendum. And it's also interesting to look at this in context. This is General Douglas MacArthur still in charge of the Japanese government at this time. So everything is in its own temporal historical context. But there were other supporters for the bond issue that was required to fund the medical center. Here, the Jackson Central Labor Union. When was the last time you saw in Mississippi a labor union being a vocal political force? That too is kind of an interesting context. Of course, the building trades also supported the bond issue because they would be the contractors to do the work. Here is a group of the two-year medical students down visiting with the then Governor Wright. Governor Hugh White, who signed the legislation, was now out of office, and Dr. Wright was working to get the medical center built. There were also other supporters of the bond issue that was required. Here's a group of Boy Scouts campaigning, out canvassing, passing out leaflets in support of the bond issue. Now this particular group of Boy Scouts is really interesting because right here we have a young Thad Cochran who went from this Boy Scout troop to the U.S. Senate. And down here we have Dr. Alvin Brent, who would grow up to be a nephrologist here in Jackson and train at the medical center and work extensively here. Interesting historical photo there, I think. But the bond issue was ultimately passed, the money was secured, and the original medical center was built. This was the medical center in 1955. The original structure consisted only of this T-shaped building, the clinical units, and the School of Medicine building, and parking was less of an issue than it is today. Now, if we take this same photograph and pan out at a larger view, we see this collection of buildings right here. These were the last buildings of the old insane asylum that was on this campus on this location from 1855 to 1935, when it was closed and replaced by the current Mississippi State Hospital at Whitfield. But these office buildings were functioning as state offices and were present after the original medical center construction. And if you go in this direction down North State Street, when it starts to, just after it branches to Old Canton Road, and look back toward the medical center, you can actually see those buildings. And just to emphasize what a large operation the old asylum is, this is a Sanborn insurance map from 1930. This is the building that you just saw looking back from North State Street, but it was a very large facility, had its own railroad spur. This is the central patient care building. Cow sheds do support a very large farming operation there, and it had its own general hospital. We will talk more about the asylum history on another day. Now, fast forward from the completion of the facility in 1955 to 1963, and we see the first two additions to the original construction. The first is the research wing, and the second is the School of Nursing. Now, again, put that in context. Immediately, it was realized that nurses are a critical part of the healthcare workforce, so a priority was to build a school of nursing on this campus. And certainly, research to support a strong basic science faculty, make new discoveries, is part of what an academic medical center does. The other thing we see now in 1963 being present is the VA Medical Center. That was not there in 1955 when the original building was completed. But there is a history that connects the medical center and the VA. The Veterans Administration was formed in 1930 in response to the needs of the veterans of World War I. General Omar Bradley, who had distinguished himself in the European theater of operations during World War II, was appointed director of the VA after the war. And he mandated that all new Veterans Administration construction was to be associated with existing schools of medicine. Now that's administratively quite clever because you're leveraging the learners and faculty at medical centers to help care for the veterans, and you're also helping the training programs by the presence of the veterans. Also, Jackson, Mississippi was an absolutely logical place to put one of these so-called Dean's VAs because of the presence of Foster General Hospital. Now, show of hands, how many of you have ever heard of Foster General Hospital? Okay, not many. This is Foster General Hospital. It was in West Jackson. It was 1,600, that's correct, 1,600 unair-conditioned beds in barracks-like buildings spread over many, many acres. It was a full-service hospital, operating rooms, everything. It was a U.S. Army hospital that was built in early 1943 to care for the injured soldiers coming back from both theaters of operation in World War II. They would come into the port of Biloxi. They would be taken by train to Camp Shelby in Hattiesburg, where they would be mustered out unless they needed additional health care, and then they would be taken by train here to Jackson, where they would receive care. This U.S. Army hospital ultimately became a VA hospital under the direction of of General Bradley. It was wartime construction. By the 1960s, it was very, very much aging and was part of this discussion to close this institution and move the remaining patients to a new VA medical center. A great idea. Unless, well, here's just a picture, and I have to thank Harrison Parker for this picture. This is what is remaining of Foster Hospital today. It's over West Jackson, just off 220 next to the VA ball fields. Now, this all sounds like a great idea unless you're a member of the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. They strongly objected to this idea. Now, if you're not familiar with the State Sovereignty Commission, it was a state agency established in 1956 by Governor Coleman to protect the sovereignty of the state from the federal government. Now, I'm an 8th generation Mississippian, so I can read this. State sovereignty means to protect racial segregation, period. And they were not happy about the fact that a VA, which they knew was going to be integrated, would be built adjacent to the University of Mississippi Medical Center. And they were not shy about saying that publicly. Quoted in the Vicksburg Evening Post, Dr. Coleman said, this will put us in a bad light. He knew that there was tension there, but he was weighing the risk and benefits of doing this. You don't want to do this just to prove for segregationists, because the veterans need the facility. Others were less tactful. Senator Earl Evans said, they're deliberately in Grayton as part of an overall scheme to force it down our throat. So there was substantial high-level opposition to putting the VA next to our facility. However, a compromise was ultimately reached for it to be built, but up on the hill, physically away from the medical center, in no way connected. No tunnel, no bridge, no walkway. That was the compromise that was reached, and the state gave the land and allowed the facility to be built, and the last patients from Foster General were taken over to the VA. Now, let me pause here. I hate any story that begins with the phrase, when I was a resident. But when I was a resident, in the VA surgical intensive care was Nurse Barnett. She was tough as nails. She wore starched white stockings with a seam down the back of the leg, and those clinic shoes with 40 coats of white polish on them. She had been a nurse at Foster, and she was wonderful. If Miss Barnett called you, you didn't question. You showed up, because she could tell a sick patient from a not sick patient. Okay, pardon a personal story. Now we are in the late 1960s, and we have the addition of this so-called South Wing. It was 2 floors of private patient care areas. This too, understood in context, the ability to maintain a private practice within the medical center is important to retaining high quality faculty. So the medical center responded in providing that type of facility that would facilitate that type of practice. By 1975, we have the new Children's Hospital, the Circle area. We have the clinical science building under construction. You can see the supports for the walkways. And I sat in histology class in 1975, I think, and watched that building be built. And my histology grades probably reflect that I was watching the building being built. Now, going a little further into the mid-1980s, the Learning Resources building has come online, the Clinical Science building is finished, and we now have a School of Dentistry on our campus, as well as the ER-OR addition. Now, like I said, that's kind of a physical review of the medical center. But like I said, there are other ways to look at it through a largely administrative lens. And one way to do that is to look at our vice chancellors over the years. And it's an interesting mix of individuals, but it's also, I think, instructive to see that we had these rather short tenures, and then we had Dr. Norman Nelson. The impact of that tenure over that 21-year period cannot be overemphasized. The ability to develop relationships with multiple classes of the IHL Board of Trustees, with multiple committee leaders in the legislature, with multiple governors over time. The value of that is immeasurable, and I think it really impacted the growth and the progress the medical center made in those 2 decades of time. I think it's also interesting that our current Dr. Woodward is in 3rd place. My money is on her to be 2nd. I'm not sure she's going to do 21 years. But again, that level of stability over a long period of time is hugely important. Now, in the time we have left, I'd like to take you on a quick tour of some spots in the medical center that you may not have seen. several of them there, and let's just jump in. Probably most of you have seen this view. This is the School of Medicine entrance, the original School of Medicine entrance, where you go in and you turn left to the Hall of Heads and you go straight to the hospital. This facade, this awning and these aluminum columns are an architecturally protected site. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History requires the medical center to keep this in its original look. But this was the entrance to the original medical center. This same architectural motif was at the original entrance to the university hospital. The same columns, same lighting, that sort of thing. And I can't prove it, but this lady here looks for all the world like Eudora Welty. I'm certain it's not, but anyway. If you go to this door and don't turn left into the Hall of Heads, but go straight down the hall, you come to this view right here. These are the restrooms on the back side of what is now Meds and Threads. And if you stand there and look at the doors and look at the rooms that have these marble thresholds and count the bathrooms, you come up with too many. There are too many bathrooms there. Now, why is that? Because the building was originally built as a segregated facility. And that's not just retrospective conjecture. Here are the original architectural drawings showing not only the multiple bathrooms here, 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 and here, but right here, there are 2 drinking fountains. Our history requires that we own these things. There are other spots in the medical center that are protected by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and one of them is Classroom 5A. Classroom 7A is also on that list. But these chairs and the interior have to be protected in perpetuity as part of the state's history. Now, if we go on up to the 6th floor, to Dr. Hall's area, this is Dr. Arthur Guyton's office. This is not the office he had when he was chair of the Department of Physiology, but the office that he occupied after his retirement. It's room N611, and it is almost exactly as it was on the day that he and his wife were killed in an auto accident. In fact, the yellow stickies that were on his computer on April 3rd, 2003 are still there. Now, I'm sure we have some researchers in the audience. This is probably an 80486 computer, and if you think you need, supercomputer connectivity to do meaningful work, I mean, just put that in perspective there. Also in Dr. Guyton's area is this workshop. Putting his work in context, developing the concepts of physiology that he was developing, doing the experimental work he was doing, was well ahead of the curve. It's not like he could go to the Fisher catalog and buy a device that would support the experimental work he was doing. So we had a full service workshop to build these items that he needed to push physiology forward as fast and as far as he was pushing. And this is a full service shop. It's got lathes and mills and welders and all manner of equipment to build these cutting edge devices. Now, the products of this shop, many of them are in these cabinets on the 6th floor. Now again, if you're a PhD candidate in the history and philosophy of science, if you could map the devices in these cabinets to publications and then to whatever physiologic equipment we have in the digital age, there's your dissertation right there. Now, going from the 6th floor down to the 2nd floor, in the area that is now the respiratory therapy support area. Back in the corner is what used to be OR number 4. And on that door is a plaque that commemorates the first human lung transplant, performed in June of '63. As that transplant was being finished, this gentleman showed up at our ER, having been shot high velocity round entering the left scapular region and exiting in the left clavicular region. The same team that performed the transplant tried to resuscitate Mr. Evers unsuccessfully. And on the following day, the Clarion Ledger reports that a suspect is being eyed, and down at the bottom of the page, you see the medical center having performed the world's first lung transplant. Now, in that same room, several months later, was the first cardiac transplant in man. I'm sure that all of you have seen this well-circulated photograph of that operation being performed. The history of this one operation is so rich from just a historical standpoint. It broke a ceiling. It moved transplantation forward. But it's got lots of ethical issues associated with it. Not just the fact that it was the first and was it properly reviewed before. I actually, when I got my postgraduate degree in bioethics, I actually wrote a paper analyzing this as best I could without bias, even being a Hardy trained surgeon, so that was probably impossible. But I have to say that Dr. Hardy was asking the right questions. He certainly did not come to the same answers that we would today, but there's lots of layers of this history, including the fact that it was a xenotransplant. Okay, but it's not the only transplant history at this hospital. In 1988, Dr. Sheshadri Raju performed the state's first bilateral lung transplant on Congressman Floyd Spence from South Carolina. He survived 13 years. And if you go to the Wikipedia page for Congressman Floyd Spence, it says that the transplant was performed at St. Dominic's. We need to correct that. Yeah. Congressman Spence did die at St. Dominic's 13 years later, but the transplant was performed here. Okay. Now we talked about Medgar Evers' assassination. When he arrived at the ER, this is where he was taken. This is trauma room C. There were 3 trauma rooms, A, B, and C, and this is where he would have been taken to be resuscitated. This spot is now a storage room, as you can see, outside of the inpatient dialysis unit. Hard to get to, but for me personally, this is also an important place because it's the room in which I met my wife, who was one of the first flight nurses here at the medical center. We met over a young man who was shot in a drug deal, and I don't want to make light of anyone's death, but he died there on the table, and in November the marriage will be 40 years old. So now, here's a place that few of the medical center community get to see. This is the loading dock. You drive through the back and you go into this big courtyard where trucks have space to maneuver, and this is the spot where hearses will pull to unload bodies from the morgue. This is that same spot on the evening of August 4th, 1964, where the three civil rights workers who were murdered in Philadelphia were unloaded. Now, the autopsies were performed here. That too is a really rich, multi-layered story about who did the autopsies, what did they show, but for a few moments, the eyes of really the world were on the medical center. Now, I can't resist telling this story or pointing this out. Those three young men were arrested, probably on trumped-up charges, then released in a way that allowed the Klan to find them, capture them, murder them, burn their car, and bury their bodies in a pond dam. That was all coordinated by a law enforcement officer in Neshoba County named Cecil Price. He was also a member of the Klan and coordinated the murder and how it was to play out. This gentleman right here is Cecil Price. Now, what level of hubris is that? To coordinate the murders, act them out, effectuate them, and then show up to unload the bodies. Now, I find this panel of pictures to be just very poignant. They were taken by a Millsaps College student named Jim Lucas, who was working as a part-time photographer for the Jackson Daily News. There's also another thing that I would like to someday learn about this photograph. This is a UMC employee, and he's walking off into this ethereal light. I would love to know who that is. If there's ever a way we can find out who that gentleman is, I would love to know that. Okay, a bit more of our tour. Now we're down to the first floor, our current day cafeteria. Now, you wouldn't think a cafeteria has a lot of history associated with it, but if you come back up the hallway, you will notice, you can see the cafeteria sign, but over here is another door. And that door is the entrance to the original black serving line, or colored as it would have been called in that day. And again, that's not conjecture. Here are the original architectural drawings showing the white serving line and the entrance over here to the colored serving line and a wall in between. Now, this is a picture of the original white serving line. And I'm not showing this having anything to do about the cafeteria. I'm showing this as the final slide to emphasize the fact that there are people at this medical center, like these ladies, who come to work every day and do their jobs. And the Guytons and the Batsons and the Hardys could not be the Guytons and the Batsons and the Hardys without these tens of thousands of people over the history of the medical center coming here and supporting what is done on this campus. So in addition to the history I've told you, the history that gets the press, the history that gets the recognition, there's a huge untold history of individuals who have stories of their own, of how they have contributed. And if any of you know of such stories or have documents associated with those stories or photographs, we would love to archive those. Just a few that I have access to. There was Miss Helvey in the library, a research librarian who, as an infant, was wrapped in newspaper and smuggled out of Nazi-occupied Hungary. I mean, that's a story. That's part of who we are. There's Ms. Connie Machado, another librarian, whose husband was an 18-year-old CIA operative in the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. Part of our story, part of the big tapestry that makes us who we are. There is Dr. Gung Chao Yang, who was raised in rural China, whose father was a physician who got in trouble for diagnosing an individual accurately as having Tourette's syndrome when he was saying terrible things about the communist government. And the local party boss said, you need to diagnose him as being mentally ill. Well, he's not mentally ill, he has Tourette's. And he was banished to the countryside. Gung Chao, therefore, learned to hunt in the jungle. And now he's one of the few Chinese guys at deer camp, because he's a huge hunter. So lots of stories, lots of roots and connectedness to our state and to personal stories. It's not just about the big names that we see all the time. It's about the mosaic that we all form. I will be happy to answer any questions, or if I don't know the answers to them, I'll be more than happy to research them. But thank you for your attention today. I appreciate it.